Hello and welcome to the Charles River Conservancy Parkland Show. My name is Renata von Charner. I'm the founder and president of the Charles River Conservancy, and we are very lucky today because we have a big picture thinker who has been thinking about the Charles River and its connections along the river, across the river, to the river in many ways. Welcome, Skip Burck.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
And Skip Burck is a landscape architect, and he actually used to live in this neighborhood.
That's right.
So it's glad you're back. And he has also worked as on the urban design committee, both of the Boston Society of Landscape Architects and the Boston Society of Architects. So he has been thinking about the city in many ways. And I will pretty much let him take the lead on that, because he has put together wonderful images. And he is currently he continues to work on the Kendall Square area, where he was the winner of a national competition that we'll see. He continues to work on projects on Fan Pier with the Filines site and Downtown Crossing, and also has a project on Fan Pier. So many projects in the Boston area. And he also has done a lot of historical research on Olmsted, the Emerald Necklace, and that will also come into our show. So we always start with this picture here because it is such a powerful river. We're so lucky to have this river in our midst. And often this river creates some challenges to go to the other side, particularly when bridges are closed, like the Longfellow Bridge partially, and bridges under construction like the Anderson Bridge. But crossing the river and reaching that river is very important. And here is Skip Burck's information, and we're talking about connectivity to the river, along the river, and across the Charles River. So Skip, take us to the big picture, the Emerald Necklace.
Okay. Well, first, just to actually back up a second, by connectivity I mean pedestrian circulation, bicycle circulation. And so I'd like to start with three precedents to sort of set the tone for what we're trying to achieve down in the lock area of the Esplanade. And the first project is the Emerald Necklace, and it's a model of connectivity and its miles of carriageways and pathways, and how kind of the interior of that section of Boston is connected to the Charles River. And of great significance too is the complexity of that connectivity, because it includes carriageways, bridleways, or did at its inception, pathways, ways for boats to go up the Muddy River and into Leverett Pond, and also the Green Line. So 5 different kinds of public circulation bundled together.
I'm just going to interrupt you a moment, because there is connectivity, but the one big part of connectivity that still needs to be worked on, and maybe it needs your brain, is of how to connect the Emerald Necklace with the Charles River. Because with the Boca Overpass, it's very hard to get from one to the other. So there is a big connectivity challenge that I hope you will put your brain to it. So I will now let you move on.
Okay. The next image. Yeah.
The next image.
Okay. Another good example of connectivity that followed the Emerald Necklace by decades is the BRA mandated Harbor Walk system that requires all private developers on the harbor to create a piece of the Harbor Walk and connect to their neighbors on either side. And it's, I think, significant not just because of its amazing access to the water at all times, but because it also links parks and destinations, like the ICA is right behind me in this photograph too. So quite important.
Yeah, and it's. We've started to work with Julie Wormser, the executive director of the Boston Harbor Association, because we also want to bring the harbor and the river closer together. So there's yet another connection of a great network that needs to be made to the Charles River. So let's go to Kendall Square.
Okay, so just a couple images from the competition we were involved in that Renata mentioned, and the same kind of theme of connectivity, and but it's a much smaller geographic area, and what we tried to do is create that connectivity by extending the waterway of the Broad Canal up further into Kendall Square as it had been historically, and then use that, like Olmsted did 130 years ago, as a way to mediate stormwater, as a way to create a pedestrian promenade to the Charles River. And then the image on the right of that is a overlay of that shows a dendritic pathway system.
What's this word? Can you explain that word?
Well, dendritic is it's actually a term to describe waterways and how a watershed is very fine at its upper edges, and as it goes down and becomes larger streams and then larger rivers, it becomes concentrated and smaller and smaller.
It looks like a tree in a way.
Yes,
yeah,
it
it's
does.
Very organic.
Yeah, right, but
Yeah.
that's a metaphor in a sense for how we were trying to have this strong central spine reach out into all the surrounding neighborhoods and in a much finer grain, and so that they could all travel into this core area.
Yeah.
And so this is the plan here that illustrates it, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but if you go to the next image, you see a couple of the sketches we did to describe different areas of this connectivity here.
Yeah. Now, before we move on to the Charles River proper, I just want to let you know that CCTV did air a show with Taha Jennings of the city of Cambridge, and if you go to YouTube, you can actually find it. If you Google YouTube and Kendall Square and Taha, you'll find it, have more details about this whole process. So let's go back to the Charles.
Okay, so here we are finally on the Esplanade, and this is only half of the system that was devised by Olmsted and Elliott back in 1894, and again it shows the continuity up the river, going over political boundaries, Cambridge into Watertown, Newton, and so on. And our little area of interest is just a tiny dot on the far right-hand side of this, close to where the dam was built on the Charles River. Next. In a way, these images are almost more informational than the plan, because you see the continuity of the pathway historically on the left. The water would have been salt water at that time, no Starrow Drive on the right. But the color image on the right then shows the same area, fresh water, there's Starrow Drive, but you have the same kind of use. People are dressed very differently, of course, but the same concentration of people wanting to get near the water.
Yeah.
So the effort I've been involved in with the Esplanade 2020 group started many years ago, actually before I got involved, and this was their early vision plan for this area of the lock, which is just below, out of sight of this image, in the Lee Pool area. And like most design problems, it goes through a number of iterations, and I'm just working on the latest of those. And so if you go to the next. This is our project area here, the area that's highlighted.
Oh, help us orient ourselves to where we are here.
Okay, so this is the historic dam on the Charles River at the top, and the Museum of Science going across the Charles River with the parking garage on the left-hand side. Leechmere Canal looping up to the far upper left.
And we have the Museum of Science crossing the river.
Right.
And we have North Point Park up here.
Right.
And we have the
Was it Nashua Street
Nashua
Park?
Street.
Park on the right.
Yeah.
And this area includes the historic gatehouses for the lock, and down at the bottom, the Lee Pool. And you can go to the next image now. We're going to kind of walk you around quickly this area. So in the foreground on the right is one of the historic lock buildings. Just beyond that on the left is a more contemporary maintenance garage that has very little historic value. And then to the left of that is the other lock building.
Sorry.
Oh, the photographs are great. The photograph on the left, taken after obviously the dam was built, the lock was built, is quite revealing. It shows the open space, the parkland to the left of the lock, also to the right of the lock. And where the Museum of Science and its garage are now, it used to be all open space. And so the connection between Cambridge and Boston was quite immediate and quite there. And compare that to the photograph on the right, where there's now parking on the left, the maintenance garage, and kind of the forested area has taken over on the Museum of Science parcel. You don't have any of that public aspect to it as it exists right now in this area. And then this photo collage shows we're going from Boston on the far right, and the lock is on the far right, across the Museum of Science, to Cambridge on the far left.
And right now, if you want to go across the river there, you really have to go downriver from the Museum of Science on the Craigie Bridge, which is a very unattractive way to cross the river because you're right next to the road.
Yes.
There's no, and for runners it's very narrow. Bicyclists have no lane, so it's a very challenging
A lot
area.
of traffic too, especially during rush hour.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you go to the next image, it's very fortuitous that we have the Science Park Green Line stop in this area, but its immediate connections to either the Museum of Science or the Esplanade are almost non-existent. They're quite difficult to navigate. And if you go to the next image, now I'm up in that Green Line stop looking down. This is what you were just describing, Renata, is the way you would get up to the Museum of Science, and the traffic there, and the Esplanade is on the left with that first low gatehouse on your left. But you can see how you'd have to traverse this sort of no man's land in order to get to the Esplanade or the museum.
And it really should be and could be the entrance to the Charles River Parklands, the Esplanade. And right now, as you said, it's a parking lot and a lot of obstacles. So
Yeah.
there is a lot of challenges ahead.
And an example of a school group navigating their way across from the west and going to the Museum of Science. You can go to the next. And so when we start looking at design issues here, we start at a large scale, a planning scale. This is a bicycle, regional bicycle plan that was put together by Livable Streets, and they call it the Emerald Network, and is probably the most accurate, the most recent of a series of kind of regional plans that show the same thing. And what is so significant about this is almost what it doesn't show. And at the very top left, you see the town of Arlington. But the bicycle network extends beyond Arlington, all through Lexington, into Burlington, and that happens all around here. And so it's an amazing network, and what we're looking at here is what are the opportunities to make this work within our little park area? What are the challenges?
So I think you focus in here on the area we're talking about.
Yes, and the park, the portion of the Esplanade is shown in green here, and these regional ways are the heavier orange lines that connect many towns out, and you can see in the dashed or dotted orange lines here what we're looking at, what we're considering, and I think what we're more and more feeling obligated to do as park designers, urban designers, which is to create that kind of connective tissue that I showed in the precedent images at the very beginning. And if you go to the next image, we're going to zero down even closer. And this shows going up and down the dam area with the Museum of Science on it, and then in dark red it shows some of the connective strategies that we're looking at in order to connect all of these diverse communities and outlying areas that come in here and need to make these connections in order to get across to different destinations.
And the fat red lines are new connections, pedestrians and bikes, and also it shows of how the T would have a direct direction to the parklands and one underneath the Craigie Bridge, as you have been a big supporter of the underpasses.
Oh, yes.
On the Boston side, further upriver with the Anderson, Western, and River Street, and I think here is another important need to go underneath there because there's so much traffic coming in from the O'Brien Highway that this really disconnects the parklands.
Mm-hmm. And we're also looking at water taxis here. That's what the light blue lines are, and so we're not just confining ourselves to terra firma here, but and water taxis were actually suggested by Eliot in 1894.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Yes.
That would really become a tourist destination.
And so what we're talking about is actually being done in and around Boston. This is a beautiful pedestrian bridge that was built on the north side of the Charles River just recently, and it is tackling all the issues that are confronting it in terms of infrastructure here. It goes over the North Station railroad tracks and then dives down under the Zakim Bridge. And it's these kinds of things that we're proposing for the lock area. Also this, Renata just mentioned this floating walkway in the lock. This is an example of such a thing in Seattle. A wide one like this could actually be the Boston-Cambridge or Boscam walkway that connects Boston to Cambridge, just west of the Museum of Science. And a narrower one like this could go down through the lock, connecting kind of the Back Bay aspect of the Esplanade to the north end.
So what the area you're describing is very interesting because there's an opportunity to create connections. It also allows to be a gateway to the Esplanade, mm-hmm. and to work with the DCAM, which is the Department of Asset Management, is in charge of the police, mm-hmm. state police, to bring all these efforts together to create a connection to Cambridge. So if you have some plans here. Let's look at those plans in a bit more detail.
Yeah, and this is sort of wrapping up. Everything I've said has been a prelude to a couple plans and sketches here at the very end. But what we're really talking about in this area, again, the lock area and the Lee Pool area of the Esplanade, are a layering of two things. One is the immediate kind of park-related program here, which is listed on the left, which has the River Swim Basin number 4 that you've been such an advocate for. It has a building in place of the existing building and Lee Pool, the River Pavilion number 6, which would provide athletic venues, lockers, possibly small cafe for use of a lot of the adjacent communities, West End, Beacon Hill, Back Bay, especially in the winter. Relocated tennis courts, room for a maintenance area for DCR, and the expanded state police presence at the lower lock building on the far right too.
One connection you haven't mentioned yet, and we can show it in the next image, is the connection from this lock area over to the Museum of Science. And
yes.
That is a new connection, not just under the bridge, but across the Museum of Science, mm-hmm. and also then over to Cambridge.
And so this is the same plan you saw just before. All we've done is add these sort of regional circulation networks through this park area. And number one would be the drawbridge that goes right across the lock. Then north of that is what Renata was just describing, which would be this floating walkway just to the left of the Museum of Science that connects then, along with the drawbridge, Boston to Cambridge for pedestrians and bicyclists. So you can make that loop and don't have to get over to the traffic on the far right. Number three would be this floating walkway that connects the north end essentially with Back Bay here without having to cross all the lanes of traffic. And then lastly, the T bridge that we mentioned, getting you down from that Green Line stop down into the park and down into the West End at the bottom of this image. And so this becomes kind of a grand central station almost, where number 5 is, where everything sort of comes together,
Yeah.
and hopefully in a very clear way, and where wayfinding maps would be available, where the history of this area could be described, and possibly the Upper Lock building, you know, could be a cafe or serve some very public function.
So the Upper Lock building is the L-shaped,
Yes.
the reverse L-shape
white.
to the left of the number 5. That's
Yes.
the existing upper lock. That means the lock had 2 components. It had an upper lock with a metal plate, which was in there, and then the lower lock is right
The
near
other white building,
the
yes.
other white building. Now, there's a yellow building to the left of the upper lock. Can you explain what your
That's
plans
a
are for that?
proposed open air pavilion. So if the Upper Lock building was a cafe or something like that, this would be a shaded area, you know, with tables and chairs. You know, if you're in the burning sun in the middle of summer, could get out of it, or you could sit outside right adjacent to
Yeah.
the edge of the lock.
It's actually one of the most beautiful spots on the river,
Yes.
because you see the Longfellow Bridge, you have the white expanse, the big expanse there, you have a playground in the back, you have the new spray pool that the Alphond family sponsored, so there's a lot happening there. Yeah.
So I think we just have 2 more images
Yeah.
here.
So we have now an image that shows
There, yeah.
those connections on a perspective.
Right. Wonderful sketch here showing the same connections I just described in plan are now in perspective, looking right down the lock, Museum of Science on the left, Esplanade on the right, with that L-shaped building, middle right. That could be the cafe, all the people right beyond that gathered in this sort of grand central square area where everything comes together. The drawbridge, which is open. Just beyond that, on top of that, the floating pedestrian walkway in the lock. To the right, the kind of bridge that goes up to the T station.
Yeah, and then comes a very dramatic final picture of a connection between Cambridge and Boston.
Yes, our own Ponte Vecchio
Yeah.
here that
Ponte Nuovo.
finishes the connection. In the background is Boston, and in the immediate foreground would be Cambridge, and a very highly activated floating walkway that even has a bridge section in the lower left here so that you can still access Leechmere Canal. But this could contain exhibits and such that relate to the Museum of Science and that are specifically related to water.
And I could imagine some of these buildings might start off as temporary buildings that might be there seasonally, and then show that there is an interest in use, and then they could be added on as permanent structures. And there are many precedents of structures like that to attract to the waterfront. Many lakes and rivers in the United States and abroad have really have seen that our rivers, now that they're clean, can be a real attraction.
And I think lastly, hopefully, the Museum of Science, you know, might even consider a entry to the museum from this side of the building, from the water side.
Yeah.
I think it would be very special.
And with a new exhibit going up that is funded by the Yorkie Foundation, there's about the Charles River, there's a whole lot of interest. So I want to show some of the people who were involved in that. You might want to just list some of them.
Oh, sure. John Shields, sort of quarterbacking the effort for a long time. And Renata's been involved, my office, Nancy Graham. Peter Kuttner from C7, Frank Costantino, who did the beautiful sketches, Joe Bagan, traffic engineer, David Greenwald, bridge designer, Mark Favorman has been tremendously involved, Charlotte DeWitt, Drew Leff, Rick Bowers, Ellen Shapiro, my good friend Paolo Vimande on water issues from the DCR, Rick Corsi and Carl Hagland. Always love working with Carl. Renata here and S.J. Port. Jay Livingstone has taken a special interest in this and has given us a lot of support. And then Museum of Science, Stuart Dash.
Well, we need to wind up our program, and if you just joined us, you can get it on YouTube, but I want to thank you, Skip, very much for being here, and I will put on the air now your contact information.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you very much for your big vision and for sharing it with us today. And here is how you can get hold of Skip, a very talented man with a big vision, and